I just wanted to talk briefly to you today about my upcoming book titled More Than Allegory. It's on religious myth, truth and belief. It's coming out at the end of April. What really motivated me originally to write this book was the culture wars, what we see around in the culture and society today, where people who are against religion, not only atheists, but are against religion, they claim the rational and empirical high ground. They portray religion as something that completely defies and contradicts rationality, and something that lacks all manner of truth, and therefore can be easily dismissed as delusion. An example of this attitude is Richard Dawkins' best-selling book, The God Delusion. My own thinking about this is that religion is an undeniable psychosocial fact. There is a recent survey that shows that 63% of the world's population declares itself to be religious, and that only 11% are convinced atheists, as they call it. So religiousness is a fact, and it is too easy a way out to dismiss it simply by labeling it a delusion. It's too easy to avoid engaging the argument and the frame of mind and the motivations behind religion by simply labeling it a delusion. I think this is a dishonest way out. I think religion is an extraordinary fact. Whether religions themselves are true or not, the fact that people are religious and have been for so long in history is in itself an extraordinary fact that needs better understanding. And what I've tried to accomplish in this book was to be fair to religion while remaining fair to rationality, parsimony, and empirical honesty. Now, of course, the question that immediately arises is there any way in which religious myths, and I'm not talking about institutionalized religion necessarily here, I'm certainly not talking about religious institutions, I'm talking about the religious mythology that underlies all that, and which is the original drive and motivation for the spread of religion across the world. Is there any truth in some way to these religious myths? Obviously, they cannot be literally true. It wouldn't be fair to reason and to empiricism to consider religious myths literally true. And it wouldn't be fair to religion either. I think a literal interpretation of a religious myth flattens it, makes it small. It's like seeing a square for the cube, a triangle for the diamond. But is there some other way in which religious myths can be true? And then this is what I explore at length in the book. I think there is a transcendent truth that is encoded through religious mythology. That those truths that are encoded are not literal, and they are not merely allegorical either. An allegory is just a roundabout way to describe something that can otherwise be described literally or be made sense of literally. But there aren't only these two kinds of truth, literal and allegorical. To believe so would entail believing that our human intellect, our ability to make sense of things with language and concepts, is sufficient to capture all relevant truths of nature. Now, we have no reason to believe that at all. We have no reason to believe that the intellectual apparatus of a primate has evolved to capture all relevant truths of the universe and existence, life, the universe, and everything. So it is very logical and from a probability perspective, almost certain that there are relevant truths relevant to our lives, to the meaning of our existence, that transcend our capacity to make sense of in literal, conceptual terms. These are what I call transcendent truths, and the case I make in the book is that religious mythology is the best way we, the human species, have found to communicate in precarious way, as the case may be, these transcendent truths and allow them to percolate through our culture in order to allow us to live lives of meaning and purpose. I think there are at least three ways in which religious mythology, when honored and when related to in a fair and open way, can help us establish a relationship with the relevant transcendent truths that help us live our lives in more productive and meaningful ways. One of them is by pointing inwards. You may say that how can that be the case, right? After all, religious myths tend to promote the worship of external agencies like deities and saints and ascended masters or whatever. How can that point inwards? Well, the case I make in the book that all these external entities are symbolic projections of aspects of our own psyche, of our transpersonal psyche, the part of our psyches that extend beyond the boundaries of our personal selves, a deeply obfuscated, deeply repressed part of our minds. And by allowing us to project these estranged aspects of ourselves onto the figures of external entities, deities, saints, and whatnot, religious mythology allows us to establish a relationship with repressed aspects of ourselves through proxy. So indirectly, they point inwards, and I think that's a very important role they play. Another role of religious myths, which I think is very important in today's society, in today's culture, is that they cancel out the implications of some deprived myths that today form the mainstream of our culture. For instance, the myth of materialism, which to anyone informed enough about the latest developments in science and philosophy since the 19th century would consider untenable, it is still the mainstream reigning ontology of our culture, which tends to eliminate all meaning from our lives. Religious myths help us cancel out the implications of these deprived cultural narratives that we have in our society. They do that symbolically. For instance, the Abrahamic myths have the notion of an immortal soul. Never mind the fact that an immortal soul is as, if you interpret it literally, is as untenable a notion as the notions behind materialism of matter outside subjective experience. But symbolically, an immortal soul allows us to establish a relationship with a certain transcendent truth, the truth of our true selves, the truth of our own transcendence, of our own immortality. Through symbols, they cancel out wrong, equivocated notions under which we live and which unfortunately impact our emotional lives. So religious myths play a compensatory role in that sense, I think. And the last role, I think, positive role that religious mythology can play in our society today, in our culture today, is what I call to bring us to the edge of the whole of conditioning. We all live in a conditioned manner. We believe in certain cultural narratives that modulate our emotional lives. Even when we say that we don't believe them, and intellectually we may not believe them, like I know many people, including myself, that don't believe at all in the fairy tale of materialism. And yet it pervades our system at an obfuscated psychic level. It modulates our emotions, even though we don't intellectually believe in them. That's what I call the hole of conditioning. It's like a hole in the ground into which we fell, and it tends to configure our world according to a certain story, according to a certain narrative that at some level, even if repressed, even if obfuscated, we tend to buy into and living according to that mistaken belief. I think religious myths, when they are authentic, when they come truly from the depths of the human psyche, they help lift us to the edge of that hole of cultural conditioning. They allow us to accept the possibility of transcendence, which opens the door for us to do or to perform a leap from the hole of conditioning, a leap to a direct relationship with the truth of our condition, which is not an easy leap, but it is an impossible leap if you are all the way down in the hole of cultural conditioning. You need to be brought to the edge of that hole so you can jump out of it, so you stand a chance to jump out of it. And I think that's a valuable role for religious mythology and religious iconography and religious rituals today that is often neglected, especially by people with a very rational, empirically grounded outlook, such as myself. And I think that that is a mistake. Religious mythology transcends rationality, but does not deny or contradict rationality. And the final thing I'd like to discuss today about this upcoming book, it's a little delicate, so bear with me. In all my work so far, 5 books, several articles, a number of blog posts, videos, interviews, I try to construct an ontological model of reality, a model grounded in reason, internal logic, consistency with empirical observations, and first and foremost, parsimony. I try to find the simplest ontological explanation that makes sense of the empirical world and our own condition as human beings. All these models, because they are grounded on reason, implicitly assume the validity of the space-time framework. Space-time is built into language, and our models are built from language, whether English or Chinese, but also mathematical notation, philosophical and logical notation, sign language, whatever. They are linguistic. Models are linguistic, and space and time are built into language at all levels. However, there is no reason for us to assume with 100% certainty that space and time themselves are not just constructs of the mind. I actually think they are just constructs of the mind. They don't really exist in any objective sense. But how can you then promote a model that is consistent with this notion, since any model will be based on language, and language implicitly assumes the objective existence of space and time? That's the dilemma I have faced so far in my previous 5 books. In this book, it's my first attempt in part 2 of this book to talk about, precariously as the case may be, but to talk about a notion, an interpretation of reality that does not assume the space-time framework as givens. It's incredibly difficult to do that. At least I have found it very difficult, and I've struggled with it for quite a while, but I arrived at something in this book that I think is worthwhile to communicate. I attempt to suggest a view of reality that does not require enlightenment or deep states of meditation purely by reading. A view of reality that looks at reality from outside the space-time framework, and that tries to lead you into the realization that space and time are being constructed in your mind at every moment. And even when I say this, at every moment, as if there were more than one single moment, as if there was anything beyond just the now, the eternal now. Even when I say this, I betray the language commitment to space and time. So I don't think I would do a better job in this video than I did in the book. But I just wanted to present the book to you in a fair way, so you know what it's about, you know what I've tried to accomplish with it, and you can judge whether this is something you might be interested in or not. I hope you enjoy the book.